So, what if we treated our schools less like places of learning and more like businesses, all competing against each other in a marketplace? It's a pretty radical idea, right? But it's one that completely swept through education systems, promising to turbocharge standards by just letting schools compete. So let's pull back the curtain on this revolution and see exactly what happens when the classroom meets the free market. And really, this entire transformation boils down to one single powerful question. Should schools have to compete for students, for funding, for their very survival, in the same way businesses have to compete for customers? This one question is the absolute foundation of what we call the new right or neoliberal approach to education. So what's the big idea here? Well, it's called the education marketplace. And the concept is actually pretty simple. The state kind of steps back from being the main provider of education and becomes more like a referee. It sets the rules for this whole new game where suddenly parents are the customers and schools are the businesses, all trying to win them over. Now, the official term for this is marketization. I know it sounds a bit jargony, but the idea is straightforward. You take the forces of consumer choice and competition, the stuff that drives the business world, and you inject them directly into public services, like schools. And the goal? To make schools sharper, more efficient, and way more responsive to what parents actually want. Okay, but why on earth would you want to do this? Well, the people who pushed for this approach made some really compelling promises. They truly believed that competition would be the engine that could drive up standards for absolutely everyone. So what were these big promises? Let's walk through them. The theory basically goes like this. First, competition forces schools to get better, to actually raise their standards to attract students. Next, all that market pressure is supposed to make them more efficient. Cut out the bureaucratic waste. Then you've got responsiveness. Schools would have to listen to parents, their customers, if they wanted to survive. And finally, with all this public data floating around, there's greater accountability. Schools just can't hide bad results anymore. But, an idea is one thing. Putting it into practice, that's a whole different ballgame. So, what specific tools were actually used to build this new education marketplace? In the UK, the real game changer was the 1988 Education Reform Act. It basically introduced a powerful new toolkit. You had standardized exams like GCSEs, which gave everyone a common yardstick. Then came the school league tables, which ranked schools based on those results, giving parents the data to shop around. And Ofsted inspections were like the quality control check. And here's the real paradox. To create this so-called free market, the state actually had to bring in more central control than ever before. Suddenly, every school's performance was out there for the world to see. And this wasn't just some British idea. It was getting a lot of fuel from some influential thinking from across the Atlantic. A huge chunk of this thinking was influenced by this landmark American study from two sociologists, Chubb and Moe. Their core argument was incredibly powerful because it was so simple. They said private schools do better than public ones because market incentives force them to be more responsive to their customers. Let's just break down their work for a second. As you can see here, their method was based on tons of quantitative data and surveys with parents. And their big finding was that school autonomy and market competition were basically the secret sauce for success. This led them to a really radical proposal, a voucher system. Basically, give parents state money to spend at any school they want, public or private. But, and this is a big but, their work got a lot of criticism for maybe not accounting for the fact that private schools often get to pick and choose their students, which might skew the results. But like with any huge revolution, there is always another side to the story. The big push for a market-driven system came with some powerful critiques and, as many people argue, some pretty serious unintended consequences. In this slide really lays out the central conflict perfectly. On the one hand, you have the promise, right? Choice will drive up standards for everyone. But the critique is that it actually leads to what's called selection by mortgage, where only wealthy families can afford to live near the best schools. The promise of efficiency is met with the criticism that it just creates a high-stakes culture of teaching to the test, narrowing what our kids actually learn. So these criticisms really boil down to a few key problems. First, there's this huge concern about equity, that the gap between rich and poor schools just gets wider. Then there's something called cream skimming. Think about it. Popular schools get oversubscribed, and like any business looking for the best results, they might be tempted to pick the easiest to teach students. This leaves other schools with the most challenging kids. That intense focus on league tables can also push things like art and music to the side. And all that high-stakes pressure, it's been linked to incredible stress, and even schools strategically removing difficult students right before inspections. This chart gives you a really simple but powerful picture of what can happen. You can see how, when funding follows the student, the popular, affluent school on the left ends up with way more resources than the school in a deprived area on the right. It creates this cycle, this feedback loop that can actually end up making inequality worse, not better. So, after decades of this massive market-based experiment, what's the final grade? Well, the reality isn't a simple pass or fail. It's a lot more complicated than that. The legacy of this whole education marketplace isn't a simple verdict. It's this deep, ongoing tension. It's a constant tug-of-war. On one side, you've got this relentless drive for efficiency, accountability, and rising standards, all measured by exam results. And on the other, you've got the absolutely vital goal of social equity, the belief that education should be about closing the gap between the rich and poor, not making it wider. And a lot of the time, those two goals are in direct conflict. And that really leaves us with a fundamental question to chew on. In this delicate balancing act between creating an efficient, competitive system and ensuring a fair, equitable one for every single child, where should we draw the line? What do we truly believe the goal of education ought to be?